Hello, it's Arran here at the Battle of Prestonpans Jacobite Museum in East Lothian, Scotland, with the latest video update for our What If interactive wargame campaign, imagining what might have happened in 1745 if the strategic decisions had been left to you. Now, it's taken us a while to get here, but finally we seem to have a decisive confrontation on the cards between the Duke of Cumberland and Prince Charles Edward Stuart. So let's find out what's happened since our last update. So just to remind you where we are in our campaign, we're now in County Durham, where the main Jacobite army, led by Charles Edward Stuart, having recently taken Newcastle and consolidated its position there over Christmas, is trying to outflank the army of the Duke of Cumberland in order to break the deadlock in the northeast of England. Now, the Jacobites had successfully outflanked Cumberland's position at Sunderland Bridge by bringing their army down the side of this map, over the River Wear at Bishop Auckland, and then giving themselves the option of marching on to England. But Cumberland's cavalry had successfully come down this road here from Sunderland Bridge in the last video. There was a cavalry clash in the area here, and that forced the Jacobites to turn and face the enemy. So we had the confrontation all staged, ready for a battle here in the landscape around SPENNYMOOR. Let's turn our 18th century map onto its side so that it matches up with our battlefield landscape on the tabletop, but I've covered the features of this battlefield in quite a lot of detail in the previous video, and hopefully you've all seen that and have it fresh in your mind. To refresh us here on the tabletop, we have at the very top of the map the River Wear and the bridge at Bishop Auckland. Then along this long ridge that dominates the battlefield, we have the three villages of Westerton, Kirk Merrington in the centre, and Ferry Hill, or Ferry on the Hill, on the far end, butting up to an area of impassable ground known as the Cars. In front of that ridge is the SPENNYMOOR itself, onto which Cumberland's army will soon be deploying. So, having finally fed the infantry onto the battlefield and seen off the cavalry on the 29th of December, the Jacobite army was able to deploy during that evening and night onto the ridgeline. This is the Jacobite right wing, and this is Murray's division, the Stuarts of Appin, the two battalions of the Athol Brigade that are here, and the Camerons holding the extreme right, the position of honour. And at the opposite end of the ridge at Westerton, we have the Duke of Perth's division, and that's a strong part of the Jacobite army comprising 3 regiments of Clandonald men, the Foot Guards of the Earl of Kilmarnock, and John Roy Stuart's regiment. Between those two wings, of course, we have the Jacobite centre, centred on Kirk Merrington, the highest point on the ridge. There is the church itself. The centre division commanded by Lord John Drummond, but Charles Edward Stuart is positioned here as well. And we have the lowland forces, Ogilvy's and Gordon's. We also have the Clan Macpherson here, the 2 mortar batteries, and behind the centre in support we have what remains of the Jacobite cavalry under the Earl of Kilmarnock. They'd had a bit of a bloody nose on the 29th of December and had lost Pitsligo's cavalry, so they are just a series of small cavalry units. How much use they'll be in this battle remains to be seen. The Jacobites are pretty pleased with their position on the ridge. It seems strong, and they're also supported by quite a substantial artillery train, and as you'll know from following the campaign, an artillery train that's had plenty of practice as well. So there are 2 Jacobite guns positioned over towards the left with the Duke of Perth. That's what we're looking at here. Those guns placed next to the partially built observatory tower. And the other 2 guns of the main army are positioned either end of the centre brigade, and the mortar batteries placed around Kirk Merrington as well. So just going back to our Virgin tabletop before the army had deployed, just to keep it nice and clear for us at this point, the Jacobite army has its left under the Duke of Perth here at Westerton, its centre under Lord John Drummond and Charles Edward in Kirk Merrington, the Earl of Kilmarnock's horse in close support behind, and the Jacobite right under Lord George Murray here at Ferry on the Hill. Now, the Jacobites might well be concerned that they have off to their extreme left their bridge back towards Scotland. And of course, in front of that is a large open space, and there is a plateau at Briars Green there in the top right-hand corner, from which enemy artillery might potentially be able to give trouble to the Duke of Perth's extreme left there. The Redcoats will, of course, be arriving from Sunderland Bridge onto the moor itself. In terms of the gameplay, a couple of important notable features. Firstly, the area known as the Cars, down at the bottom of the map, that is deemed impassable. And the larger villages of Ferry Hill and Kirk Merrington in the centre are deemed each to be a single defensible zone, should the Jacobites need to move out of line into new positions there, whereas Westerton is deemed to be too small to be a defensible position. Bishop Auckland's Palace, however, is a defensible hard position, as is Bobby Shafto's Place, the manor house and estate closer to the road onto the moor. I think that's pretty much all we need to know before we get into the detail of what happens on the 30th of December when our two armies finally come to blows on the SPENNYMOOR. I should just say, though, that the Duke of Cumberland and Charles Edward Stuart are fairly evenly matched in numbers, although Cumberland has a substantially larger cavalry force and the Jacobites have an advantage in artillery. First to arrive on the battlefield is Cumberland's cavalry division under General Huske, and this is comprised of the small regiment of Yorkshire Hunters, the small regiment of Georgia Rangers in greencoats, and two full regiments of dragoons, Kerrs and Cobhams, and certainly the latter two had proven their value in the skirmishing the previous day. The British cavalry is hoping to redeem itself after some pretty spectacular failures earlier in the campaign in the wake of Prestonpans, and then the loss of the cavalry brigade proving a real problem for Marshal Wade in his attempted invasion of Scotland too. So the cavalry with something to prove, I think, at the Battle of SPENNYMOOR. Cumberland's 9 regiments of foot have deployed in 2 brigades, Henry Hawley's and the Earl of Albemarle's on the right. They have decided to approach the moor in 2 lines, in Hawley's brigade and in Albemarle's 3 deep, so as to have a greater degree of protection. So Cumberland already, as he deploys onto the moor, is sacrificing the length of his line for its depth. From the ridge, of course, the Jacobites have a fantastic view of the deploying British lines, and no sooner have they come into the range of their cannons, the Jacobites open fire, officially beginning the Battle of SPENNYMOOR. The British lines are undeterred by the Jacobite artillery shots, most of those cannonballs burying themselves safely into the moorland and doing little damage on the approaching British infantry. And a fine sight they make as the British army advances straight towards the ridge. What you're looking at here is Hawley's on the left and Albemarle's with its 3-line formation on the right. Cumberland there in the centre, directing his army straight towards Kirk Merrington and Ferry Hill. Cumberland advances steadily and maintains his line as they go, making sure that their own artillery can keep up with the pace of the advance, ignoring the whistling Jacobite cannonballs, which do very little damage as Cumberland's army advances towards them. Then, once they're able to, the British cannons deploy, and those cannons begin counter-battery fire, targeting the Jacobite guns on the ridge before them. Now, as Cumberland's relatively deep formations begin to advance across the moor, they look an awfully long way away from some of the men in the Duke of Perth's division. In fact, Perth decides to incline some of the extreme left of his line forwards to face into the moor in case potentially he's able to threaten the flank of Albemarle's division as it goes forwards. To the Jacobite surprise, you see, there seems to be no attempt by the British army to shog towards the Jacobite left, threatening to cut it off from Scotland. Instead, Cumberland seems to be preparing for an all-out assault on the central strong points of the ridge itself. But the Duke of Perth's motion does seem to give some pause to Albemarle, who halts his brigade on the moor even as Hawley's continues to advance towards the Jacobite right. You see the Jacobite gun there, just below Kirk Merrington, still trying to fire away, despite having taken casualties from very effective counter-battery fire from Cumberland's advancing pieces too. And at this point, Hawley's men come into musket range, and they unleash a withering volley onto the men of the Appins and the Athol Brigade, a very effective fire, which certainly shakes the Jacobite right. Now, maybe the Jacobites are losing efficiency because they're firing downhill. Perhaps they're firing over the heads of their enemies, but certainly Hawley's infantry are putting a much more effective musket fire into the Jacobite divisions under Murray here. Then, in a move which catches the Jacobites by surprise, Husk and his cavalry force is unleashed all onto the Clan Cameron. It had been assumed by the Jacobite command that the presence of Husk on this end of the battlefield was simply to deter the Camerons from sweeping down off the ridge. Instead, the Yorkshire hunters lead the charge, and the British cavalry goes straight up the hill and slams into Clan Cameron. The Yorkshire hunters surge bravely up the hill with the rest of the cavalry in support behind them, and although they're only a small unit, they charge straight into the Clan Cameron. Those Jacobites offer a closing fire that whistles over the head of the horsemen, clearly panicked. The Camerons are looking very shaky indeed. The Yorkshire hunters are indeed successful at driving the Camerons back into Ferry Hill, but they have taken hits in the process of doing so. Nevertheless, they elect to sweep on forwards into the village, where the Clan Cameron, now that they're in the protection of the narrow streets and the tangles of houses, have at last got some protection from the charging horsemen. In fact, at this point, the decision to attack a village with cavalry starts to look a little bit questionable. Quite remarkably, in fact, the Clan Cameron, despite being very close to breaking, managed to hold that village just long enough for the rest of the Jacobite right to withdraw into a better position. The Jacobites had been drawn up across the face of the village. Now, the Athol Brigades, 1st and 2nd Battalion, have successfully withdrawn to create a new line at right angles to the Jacobite centre. They have, however, in doing so, had to sacrifice the Camerons themselves in Ferry Hill and the Stuarts of Appin, who are left on the outside, Murray holding their ground with them as much as they can. They've been driven back from their initial position by the sheer volume of musketry that they have been enduring. Disordered, they're not able to join their comrades as the line reforms. Now, that redeployment of the Jacobite right was done by Charles Edward himself, overriding the failed orders that Lord George Murray had given in the confusion of the attack. Fortunately, there was plenty of time to do it because the Camerons had held in the village long enough to push the Yorkshire hunters back, at which point it seemed that they might just be able to hold the position. It is a temporary reprieve. The Clan Cameron simply can't resist the weight of Husk's entire cavalry brigade and its Cobham's dragoons that finally break them, riding straight through the village of Ferry Hill and then emerging to the rear of the Stuarts of Appin. They then, on the succeeding turn, charge into the flank of the Appin men, although Murray has rallied them and given them sufficient strength to be able to, in fact, hold off that flanking charge and drive Cobham's back away from the Ferry Hill. In time, the Stuarts of Appin are able to withdraw backwards to form with the rest of their comrades, and the threat of the British cavalry being able to take Ferry Hill and then sweep around the rear of the ridge has, for the time being at least, been alleviated. So the prince is able to stabilise his line. He brings Kilmarnock and the cavalry up to support the right rather than the centre, and the Jacobites now start to use their muskets to try and hold back Hawley's advancing brigades. So while there have been some hair-raising moments for the Jacobites over on the extreme right, they've also lost one of their guns in the counter-battery action there too. The Duke of Perth has taken the initiative on the far left of the Jacobite line, and as you can see from this image, he's led his division forwards towards the SPENNYMOOR, and that threat now keeps Albemarle out of anything that might happen over on the Jacobite right centre. The centre itself has begun to incline a little as well, so that it can potentially bring some flanking fire towards Hawley's infantry divisions. And looking at the same scene from the British side of the moor, we've got Husk's cavalry riding into the village of Ferry Hill on the top left of the picture. We've got Hawley's infantry now moving towards Kirk Merrington, having not yet secured the road into the village as they'd hoped. And then Albemarle's strong brigade turning and advancing towards the Duke of Perth's men who are moving onto the ridge, bringing their artillery forwards in support as well. So here we are over on Albemarle's brigade, which is formed up deep with artillery in support, ready to resist whatever the Duke of Perth attempts to throw at him across the open expanse of moorland. If Perth was reticent, however, he's throwing caution to the wind, because he knows that only by alleviating the pressure elsewhere on the battlefield will the Jacobites have a chance of resisting that big attack on the Jacobite right. In fact, the Duke of Perth finally gets some decent rolls for the orders in the Jacobite lines, and his regiments surge forward. The Clandonald lead the way, smashing into Albemarle's men with the foot guards of Kilmarnock in close support. The Clandonald take heavy casualties from the closing fire of the British lines as the charge surges forwards, but that terrifying charge does hit home. In fact, the Clanranald succeed in breaking the first line on the right of Albemarle's, and then, although they're too battered to follow through themselves, Kilmarnock's foot guards take over and surge into the second line. That line proves too deep for the Jacobites to penetrate through. Kilmarnock's foot guards are pushed back, and then a withering volley from the British line disperses what remains of the Clanranald regiment. Is the whole Jacobite army about to suffer the same fate? This charge now has a very desperate all-or-nothing feel about it, but the Glengarry and the Keppoch men smash forwards, and they go through regiment after regiment, penetrating through to the second line, just as their comrades from Clanranald had done beside them. The Duke of Perth, in fact, kept his cool despite the loss of the Clanranald men as they scattered from the field, and he was able to bring up his reserve regiment, John Roy Stuart's men, and thrust them forwards into the line. Thus stabilised, the Duke of Perth's division was able to break through the second line of Albemarle's, fighting the way through to the single battalion that held in the third line. Albemarle's brigade was broken. So now success depended for Cumberland entirely on Hawley's infantry being able to push up towards the Jacobite centre at Kirk Merrington. And they were depending in turn on Husk's cavalry being able to penetrate through Ferry Hill and then sweeping round the rear of the Jacobite positions. But so many of the Jacobite right-hand regiments had been able to redeploy and stabilise their position that Husk's cavalry had been stalled. Worse, a succession of disorders placed on Hawley's infantry battalions prevented them from making much progress as well. And then they came into range of the Jacobite mortar batteries placed in the churchyard at Kirk Merrington. And these mortar batteries inflicted terrible damage on the British advancing infantry lines. Now, Cumberland at this point assessed the situation and saw the very real danger of his army's complete destruction. The Jacobite right, having redeployed into a new position in front of Kirk Merrington, had held. The centre had begun to advance, with Ogilvy's coming down off the ridge and the Écossois behind them, and the Jacobite left had been extremely successful and penetrated through two lines of Albemarle's infantry. At this point, the only sensible thing Cumberland could do was to try and extract as much as he possibly could of his army from this dangerous situation. He had the option of trying to retreat through on the road to England, out through Ferry Hill, but that would have left his columns raked by Jacobite fire and potentially counterattacked by the Jacobite right. Instead, therefore, he decided to withdraw back across the moor towards Sunderland Bridge. This at least gave him the chance to link the two fractured segments of his army back together. In doing so, he sacrificed the Georgia Rangers and one of his infantry battalions, who remained behind as a screen to protect the withdrawing army from the Jacobite centre and right. And the Jacobite left, fortunately, had suffered so many casualties in its triumphant charge that it was unwilling to press home against the withdrawing redcoats. The Duke of Perth decided that discretion was the better part of valour here. He'd achieved a huge amount over on the Jacobite left, but his regiments were largely shaken, and if they were to be broken by closing fire whilst attempting to press their advantage, then those regiments could be out of action for the march on London when it comes. And so they held back, and they allowed, under the screen of cavalry that Cumberland was able to throw out, the withdrawal of the surviving shattered remnants of the Duke of Cumberland's army. The Jacobite cavalry did attempt to sweep back through, reoccupying Ferry Hill, and briefly contemplated coming down off the ridge and pursuing the Duke of Cumberland, but their orderals were not as successful as Cumberland's in this instance, and the weakness of the Jacobite cavalry meant that they were reluctant to push too far beyond the support of their infantry. As evening fell, Prince Charles Edward Stuart found himself in possession not only of the ridge and its 3 villages, but of the moorland as well, as his enemy withdrew into the darkness towards Durham. The Jacobites had destroyed 5 battalions of redcoat infantry during the course of the battle, mostly those on the right, and several in Hawley's brigade, who fell mainly to the mortar fire. They themselves had seen the Clancameron broken and the Clanranald regiment broken. But as victors in control of the field, they will be able to rally at least some of these men back into small units for the coming campaign. It had therefore been a very successful day for the Jacobite army, despite, it must be admitted, some very hairy moments early on in the game when they took high casualties in that first phase of Husk's unexpected cavalry attack. The Jacobites have won the Battle of SPENNYMOOR. And in doing so, Charles Edward has secured at last the road to London. There is no field army between him and the capital. In London itself, George II has the Guards battalions and is rapidly raising as much militia as he can pull together. But the campaign is far from over. Cumberland has a little bit of a force still left at Durham. The Jacobites may choose to try and bottle him up there before advancing south, but time may not be working to their advantage. The Prince of Hesse Castle has been summoned from Europe, and he may bring fresh, veteran Hessian soldiers to shore up George II's position in the south of England. Cumberland, if left to his own devices, could either shadow the Jacobites south with what remains of his force, particularly that cavalry brigade, or he might even attempt to sail around to London by sea. And of course, we are all waiting with bated breath to hear whether these Jacobite successes have been enough to trigger French invasion in support of Charles Edward's march south. What happens next remains to be seen. And so the Battle of SPENNYMOOR is over. We hope you've enjoyed this report. The battle has been won and lost. The campaign is far from over. See you next time.